I want to welcome you tonight to our Lenten series. And with me is my good friend Todd, who we take this journey together as we have been given the easiest passages of Mark. But before we start that, and before we thank Shelby Olive for giving us the easiest passages of Mark to talk about tonight, I do want to say that we should do this in 60 seconds, because everything in Mark is faster. So you think we could do the whole Bible study in 60? No, it's not.
Let's do it.
That's right. We're going to take a little longer tonight. But we start tonight with an entry, which is a little ironic in chapter 11, because it starts with this entry into Jerusalem, entry into the temple, but it's the end, right? I mean, like, this is the big dramatic roll the credits. Jesus is almost dead. And we're not quite into the same form of resurrection. I mean, we're going to resurrect Jesus, but Mark is really about this moment, right? And so it's not so much just about Jesus' death, but my question is this also about Jesus is putting all this into perspective? And what does he do that? He comes to his Father's house, and he comes up the road, down the road, and up to Jerusalem to start this process, this teaching, these encounters with his disciples and people. What do you think stands out to you? I mean, just before we dive into this, what really stands out to you about this?
It's the conflict. For me, what stands out is this conflict with the Pharisees. Mark has been marked so far by this pattern of misunderstanding, following Jesus' teaching. Nobody seems to really grasp what he's getting at. And here he is with these people that should grasp it, because they're the religious elite. They're the people who are trained. And in fact, I think we can see from chapter 11 and chapter 12 that they do grasp it. They're just unwilling to let go and to let Jesus be Jesus. And so the thing that stands out to me, and especially these chapters of Mark, is this conflict that Jesus is in with the religious leaders of his day.
These aren't just casual religious followers. I mean, these are the folks that read the Bible 40, 50 times a day. I mean, like, these are people that are dedicated to whole chunks of what this is. And so the irony here is that here comes Jesus to his Father's house to deliver all the promises of prophecy. And what does he find himself doing? Having to prophesy to the people that should have understood in the first place.
Right.
Having to teach, having to correct, having to move forward.
Yeah.
It's frustrating, right? You can feel his frustration in this.
Yeah, and he even says to them when he clears the temple that, why are you doing this? The Lord needs it and will send it. No, this is the entry. When he cleanses the temple, he says to them, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but you have made it a den of robbers. And he's quoting Isaiah, he's quoting Jeremiah, the big two prophets of the Old Testament there. And the chief priests and the scribes heard it, and they kept looking for a way to kill him. But by this point in Mark, Jesus has gained the favor of the crowd.
Right.
And so they're afraid that he's going to take their power from them,
right?
Because if they turn against him, then the crowd could turn against the Pharisees.
And the greatest challenge, and this is the hard part for me, because it's something that I think we all struggle with. So this is not like a story about people a long time ago. Mark can start to feel like, these idiots. Like, if they had just opened their eyes, this is the Jesus that's coming back. This is what's going to save us all. But these people do what we do, right? And that is, they had a problem. The people that were coming to the temple had money with the face of an emperor on it. Mm-hmm. But you can't bring the face of an emperor into God's house, because that's a graven image. We're definitely getting into Ten Commandment breaking here. So what do? They say, well, let's help people. Let's change the money, right? And then let's change that money into something that they can use. An offering, maybe just gold in itself that's uncut, whatever they're bringing in to give into this temple. And so something that was supposed to be helpful for the Jewish people coming to the temple, all of a sudden now you've got people that are like, oh, but we could make money off of this. Oh, wait, but now we're set up a process. Let's set up a committee for where the money changers are going to be. And then let's put the money changers closer so people don't have to go as far. And all of a sudden now, what are they doing? They're looking at their livelihoods instead of looking up to see the Jesus that's actually come to save them. And how often does that happen? Like on a daily basis for me, Monday through Friday.
Absolutely.
I get so caught up in my livelihood. I get so caught up in how I'm putting food on the table for them. I get so caught up in something that is not of God. Would I miss Jesus if he came to the church? Because I'm too focused in on this.
Yeah. I think that's something that, we don't struggle with this idea of bringing images into church and the whole money changing that was going on in the temple in those days. Like that's not the direct issue. We don't need to get bogged down in that detail.
Right. Sure.
But what we do struggle with as a church and maybe even to a larger extent than in the first century is turning our faith and our religion into something that winds up marketed and becomes a product.
Right.
And asking ourselves, how does marketing our faith cause us to abbreviate it or truncate it? And when anytime we are robbing something out of the gospel, we are we're at risk of turning it into something that it's not.
The money changers came to the temple steps. I mean, you just pointed this out for what they could get out of it.
Yeah.
Do I ever come to church for what I could get out of it? Or do I come to church, right, to encounter Jesus and ask, what can I give? Which was the whole point of the temple. What can I offer? What can I give to God, right? And yet, this is a direct conflict. So now all of a sudden, now this leads us into what's next. Jesus comes to the temple, and he finds that he can't be their Savior or their Messiah, either one, which are two different things. He comes to the temple to find a way to help change their perspective. He does it in a lot of different ways, because this isn't a one visit to the temple.
Right.
I mean, we're going to the temple 2 or 3 times here, maybe 4, right? And you count each visit that you make to the temple, and what happens? Well, the first time he turns over the tables, like big dramatic moment, right? Big preacher moment. Let's get these things out of here and let's throw them out. Let's make a big scene. And then there's moments where he just sits quietly and tells a story, right? Or then there's a moment where he just scares the mess out of everybody.
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden we're getting these perspectives of a big word that you and I learned in school called eschatology. I mean, if you were to just tell your kids about what eschatology is, what would you say? Like, how would you give it to your kids?
I guess I would say that it's really our discussion about how things come to an end. It's the final pieces of God's will for humanity.
Is that for Jesus, or is that for everybody?
What do you mean?
Like, what end are we talking about? Whose end are we talking about here?
That's part of the question, right?
Right.
Figuring out those details is a piece of the puzzle. But I think what we can learn by this part, where Jesus turns in Mark 13 and starts talking in eschatological terms and apocalyptic terms about.
It makes you feel smart.
It does.
Everybody should feel smart because they can now drop the word eschatological and just a common conversation, right?
I don't know how to spell it. Just consult your spell checks on that. But
that's what iPhones are for.
Autocorrect probably will change that to something else. But when Jesus foretells the destruction of the temple and he's talking about this desolating sacrilege and the persecution of Christians being foretold, he is using words that definitely are conveying emotion and a sense of urgency that 2,000 years later we don't necessarily feel on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, that's as a motorcycle goes by, that's the 60 seconds of mark, right? I mean, that's like that 0 to 60 of mark. Like, there should be urgency in what we do. And we find that in the early church, right? I mean, this drives.
Yeah, you see it in Paul's letters. Paul talks about Jesus returning imminently in his earlier letters. And, in 1 Thessalonians, he talks about those who have gone to sleep. Because it's hard for the early Christians to even imagine that people are starting to die. And part of that's because of what Jesus taught right here, where he says, where he's telling people to be vigilant. Keep awake, for you don't know when the master of the house will come. Keep awake, remain vigilant. He says in here that this generation won't pass away until my return.
What do you do with that? I mean, it did pass away. I mean, literally, people died, and a new generation came, and then another generation. And how are we 14, 15, 16, 18 generations in? I don't know how you count all of that, but how do you deal with that? The first generation did die.
I think it's a first. I mean, the first thing you do is you acknowledge it, and you have to have that understanding when you read the Gospels and when you read Paul's letters that these were people that believed Jesus would return imminently,
right.
and that affects the way we read Paul's writings. That, if you believe Jesus is coming back in thousands of years, you're going to write and relate to people differently about your faith than you are if you believe he's coming before you have passed from this world.
When I was younger, I would have taken that verse, and I still could do it today, and say, well, I don't know. This is that piece in here. I don't know. And I think that's still my answer for this day, is we don't have an answer to everything that Jesus said, right? In fact, when you start talking about the end of the world here, we really don't know what he meant by that.
No, we don't. In fact, and Jesus says, right, about that day or hour, no one knows, neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. Beware, keep alert. And it's tempting, I think, for 21st century Christians to take the words of the Bible that talk about end times and to turn it into almost a replacement for the gospel. That vigilance becomes the religion instead of the love for God and the love for neighbor that Jesus has given us right here in this context. Love God, love your neighbor. But it can be tempting to look for meaning in the midst of upheaval and injustice in the world and violence in the world. But Jesus says that the end is not signaled by those events. Nobody knows when that's coming, but be vigilant and be ready is what he says. And we remain ready, not by watching for signs, but by emphasizing the love of Jesus Christ for everyone that we encounter.
So the end goes back to the beginning. Our temptation is for us to get so caught up in the money and the daily living of our hands that we don't see the God that comes into our life. There's actually a pretty disturbingly obvious parable here where it's just crazy, some of these stories, right? So the tenant, the owner leaves this walled garden. The tenants are there, and he sends the servant to check on him, and every time he sends a servant, they beat the servant. Okay, pretty vivid picture here, right?
Yeah.
But instead, this goes back to what we understand of what are we watching for, right? And what are they doing? Are they protecting the farm? Are they just getting angry? Are they just wanting more? Are they greedy? What's going on in these people's lives? What the reality is that they're missing who the owner of the land is sending to them for help, for communication, for connection, right? And I wonder, how much do we miss in our day, right? This is about the end of the world. But for me, as a practical takeaway for Lent, we're in a season where we have probably given something up to become more aware for something else, right? In the season of Lent, we're saying, hey, I'm not going to go to lunch every day. I'm going to pray instead. I'm not going to have Coke, but every time I think about a Coke, I'm going to open up my Bible and read a scripture passage. These are the healthy ways of Lent, right? Where we take something away, we add something in. Well, this is a practice of Lent. I want to become more aware, not skinnier, more aware of God in my life. Right? So what is that? Is that reading the Bible? Is that going to a Bible study? Is that doing a new small group like this? Is that praying more often? Is it just sitting outside and listening to God? It's all about being more watchful, right? So yes, this is about the end of the world. Yes, we're waiting for Jesus to come back. But this crazy little parable here about the tenants is about paying attention to daily life, right? It wasn't the end of the garden. It wasn't the end of the walled, place where they're supposed to be giving fruit. It's to pay attention to the servants that are coming that God is sending into your life and the messages that God is sending you. And so as we wait for the end of the world, do we think that God is only going to come at the end of the world, or do we think that God might be sending messengers and hope along the way? Right, and I wonder what that means for us. Yeah, something for people to take away of chapter 11 and chapter 13. What do you want them to take away? I mean, how would you land this for our small groups tonight?
Well, so much of our thinking about Jesus comes in terms of his love for all, his teaching, his humility. He takes on this humiliating death. He washes the feet of the disciples. He does all of these things. But here in these chapters, really what we see Jesus doing is provoking the issue, right? We see him at odds with the teachers. He says when he clears the temple, he says that my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations. And in the context of the withered fig tree, he's saying the season for that has passed. You have let that go, and I'm calling a new people to do that work instead. And so, and he's talking directly to the religious leaders of the day, and he's telling them, you have screwed this thing up so badly that it's time for a new order.
Could that be relevant today? Yeah.
Maybe. I don't know.
Yeah.
But so what he's doing is he's driving them from the temple. He's telling this parable of the wicked tenants in order to provoke it. And you can see in Mark 11, 12, and 13, they are looking for ways to kill him. And later in chapter 15, Jesus is brought before Pilate, and Pilate knows what these guys are all about. They want Jesus out of the way because he threatens to take away what they have, which is a false authority. And so Jesus is saying to them, watch out because I'm coming for you. And it's really this, Jesus obviously knows what's happened. Mark has told us from the get-go that Jesus is foretelling his own death throughout the gospel. And so Jesus he's forcing the issue. He is bringing these events to happen. And even though, and all of that leads up to his prayer in Gethsemane of, let this cup pass from me, but not my will, let your will be done. And so as a takeaway from this, these 3 chapters, Jesus does all the great things. He teaches with his actions in the temple by driving out the money changers. He teaches with his parables in the parable of the wicked tenants. And then he turns up the volume, so to speak, and he uses this language of apocalypticism, and he talks about the moon turning red and the sun going dark, and he scares people a little bit, and he puts some emotion into it, and he really brings on a sense of urgency for his believers to do the thing that they're called to do, which is to share the gospel and make disciples.
And what's fascinating is he gives us this illustration of what we do as we wait. So if we're not going to look at our money, and we're not going to get caught up in all what the money changers did, what's Jesus provoking us to? Well, the irony of that is what we find one of the most famous verses of all time in these chapters is, well, so what are we supposed to do? Like, what is the greatest commandment? How are we supposed to live? As they're trying to trick him. Love God, love your neighbor. And embedded in all this is this wise person, in the midst of all these idiots, this wise person that says, wait, if we do that, we're giving more than we've ever given before. And Jesus says, yes. So in our end times, right, which we might be in the end times, right, as we're waiting for this to happen, this urgency, what are we being provoked to? What's our urgency to become? To give more love to God and each other than we've ever done before. Okay. That's easy, right?
Yeah.
That's good. I love this. I love doing this not by myself and quietly in my room. I love doing this with my friends and doing this with each and every one of you. So thank you for being with us tonight, and I hope you have great discussions as we continue this small group series in Lent.